By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached Japan's doorstep. For years, Japanese cities had lived with the distant threat of American bombers, but the skies above the home islands were still believed to be defensible. Japanese pilots trusted their interceptors. Anti-aircraft guns guarded the cities. And for a long time, American bombers arrived alone, vulnerable, and burning. Then something changed. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a new bombing tactic. It was a sound. A sharp, unfamiliar engine note began to echo above Japan. Fast, smooth, relentless. At first, civilians didn't understand it. Soldiers looked up confused. Fighter pilots strained to identify it through clouds and glare. And then they saw it. Long wings, a sleek silver body. A fighter that didn't turn away. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. Until then, American bombers had suffered terrible losses over Japan. Fighters like the B-29 Superfortress could reach Japanese cities, but they couldn't protect themselves the entire way. Escort fighters lacked the range. Once the bombers reached their targets, they were alone. Japanese pilots knew this. They waited. They climbed. They attacked from above. And it worked. Until the Mustang. The P-51 didn't just escort bombers to Japan. It stayed. It followed them all the way in and all the way back out. For the first time, Japanese pilots found themselves facing an enemy fighter over their own cities. One that didn't run low on fuel, didn't disengage, and didn't break formation. The psychological shock was immediate. Pilots reported being chased for miles. Interceptors were attacked before they could even reach the bombers. Airfields themselves were no longer safe. To the Japanese military, this was deeply unsettling. The skies over Japan had always been a last line of defense. Familiar, controlled, predictable. Now they belonged to someone else. And as the P-51s multiplied, their presence sent a chilling message. The war was no longer at Japan's borders. It was overhead. And it was staying. At first, Japanese fighter pilots believed the P-51 was just another American aircraft. They were wrong. In the early months of combat, Japanese pilots had relied on experience and instinct. Aircraft like the A-6M0 were lightweight, extremely maneuverable, and deadly in close dogfights. Against earlier American fighters, this advantage often meant survival. But the Mustang changed the rules. The P-51 didn't fight the way Japanese pilots expected. It didn't turn tightly. It didn't bleed speed. It didn't stay low. Instead, it stayed fast, terrifyingly fast. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could climb high, dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and keep its energy through the fight. Japanese pilots soon realized that once a P-51 chose to engage, escape was nearly impossible. The Mustang attacked from above. One pass, a burst of .50 caliber fire. Then it climbed away before a Zero could respond. Japanese pilots described it as fighting a ghost. They would see silver flashes streak past their canopy, hear bullets rip through metal, and by the time they turned to respond, the Mustang was already gone, setting up another attack. Worse still, the P-51 pilots were relentless. They didn't break off to save fuel. They didn't hesitate over enemy territory. They stayed with the bombers, like shadows with guns. This shattered Japanese defensive tactics. Interceptors were attacked before reaching altitude. Formations broke apart. Coordination collapsed. Even experienced aces found themselves outmatched. The fear wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Pilots knew their aircraft could not take damage. They knew they couldn't dive faster. They knew they couldn't outrun the Mustang. Every interception became a gamble, and many pilots began to hesitate. In aerial combat, hesitation is deadly. By late 1944, reports from Japanese units used a new kind of language, not tactical descriptions, but emotional ones. The enemy fighter does not leave. It hunts us. It waits above. The Mustang had become more than a plane. It had become a presence, and Japan's skies were no longer safe. By early 1945, the war in the air had crossed a point of no return. American P-51 Mustangs were no longer just escorting bombers. They were owning the sky. For Japanese cities, this was a terrifying shift. Mustangs arrived hours before the bombers, sweeping ahead in wide arcs. They hunted patrols, destroyed interceptors on climb, and circled airfields with impunity. For the first time, Japanese pilots faced enemy fighters above their own homes, not briefly, but constantly. Airfields became death traps. As Japanese fighters lifted off, Mustangs were already waiting at altitude. Engines overheated. Pilots pushed their aircraft beyond safe limits just to reach the fight, often only to be cut down seconds later. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, was now painfully obsolete. It couldn't absorb damage. It couldn't outrun the Mustang. It couldn't climb fast enough to escape. P-51 pilots exploited this mercilessly. They attacked in pairs and flights, diving through formations with precision. They avoided turning fights and used altitude like a weapon. Every engagement ended on their terms. For Japanese civilians, the fear became visible. Silver fighters roared low over cities. Gunfire echoed before air raid sirens. Pilots were shot down in plain view of their neighborhoods. The psychological effect was devastating. The idea that Japan's homeland skies were inviolable collapsed. Commanders scrambled for solutions. Older pilots were recalled. Younger, barely trained pilots were rushed forward. New tactics were written and rewritten. None of it mattered. Mustangs adapted faster. Some Japanese units turned to desperate measures: ramming attacks, head-on collisions, last-ditch intercepts that sacrificed the pilot to damage the bomber formation. But even these extreme tactics struggled to reach their targets, because the Mustangs were always there first, and always waiting. By the spring of 1945, Japanese pilots began referring to American fighters not by model number, but by reputation. They come from above. They never leave. They decide who lives. The sky itself had become hostile, and Japan was losing control of the air, one Mustang at a time. By mid-1945, Japan's air war had become a battle of survival rather than strategy. The constant presence of P-51 Mustangs had drained the Japanese Air Force of more than aircraft. It had drained it of confidence. Fuel was scarce, spare parts were rare, and experienced pilots were nearly gone. Facing an enemy that dominated the sky, Japanese commanders made a decision born of desperation. If they could not defeat the Mustangs, they would try to ignore them. This was the rise of kamikaze tactics on a massive scale. Young pilots, many with only minimal flight training, were sent aloft with a single objective: reach the bombers or ships at any cost. Survival was no longer part of the plan. But even here, the Mustang stood in the way. P-51 pilots quickly learned to identify kamikaze formations. They attacked aggressively, breaking them apart long before they reached their targets. Head-on passes shredded lightly armored aircraft. Precision gunnery turned desperate charges into falling debris. American after-action reports were grim. Mustangs were not just interceptors. They were executioners. They cut down attackers miles from the fleet. They prevented collisions that could have cost hundreds of lives. They forced kamikaze pilots into chaotic dives that ended harmlessly in the sea. For Japanese pilots, this was terrifying. They were being hunted even on missions where they no longer expected to return. Some turned back. Some froze. Some never even reached the bombers. The psychological weight was crushing. To face death willingly is one thing. To face death without even reaching your target is another. Meanwhile, Mustangs continued to patrol Japanese skies relentlessly. Airfields, supply routes, and rail lines were strafed daily. The home islands were under constant aerial pressure. The message was unmistakable. There was no safe altitude, no safe direction, no safe moment. The Mustang had become a symbol of inevitability. And for Japan, the end was approaching, carried on silver wings. When the war finally ended, Japan's skies were quiet again. But the silence carried memories. For Japanese pilots who survived, the P-51 Mustang was not remembered as just another enemy aircraft. It was remembered as a turning point, the moment when control of the air was lost forever. In post-war interviews and debriefings, Japanese aviators spoke less about tactics and more about feelings. They talked about exhaustion, about looking up and knowing the enemy was already there, about hearing an engine and realizing there was nowhere left to run. The Mustang had not simply destroyed aircraft. It had destroyed certainty. Strategically, its impact was undeniable. With long-range escort finally solved, American bombers could strike Japan repeatedly and systematically. Industry collapsed. Transportation networks failed. Air defenses crumbled under constant pressure. But psychologically, the effect was even greater. The idea that Japan's homeland could be defended from the air had been a pillar of morale. The P-51 shattered that belief. Once the skies were lost, everything beneath them became vulnerable. Even Japanese civilians recognized the difference. They learned to distinguish the sound of Mustangs from bombers. They knew when the silver fighters arrived first, something worse was coming. After the war, aviation experts on both sides studied the Mustang closely. Not just its speed or range, but the doctrine it represented. Control the air. Stay longer than the enemy expects. Make the sky hostile. The P-51 Mustang embodied all of it. It wasn't the most heavily armed fighter. It wasn't the most maneuverable, but it arrived at the right moment and stayed. Today, the Mustang is celebrated in museums and air shows, polished and beautiful. But over Japan in 1945, it was something else entirely. It was fear given wings. It was dominance made visible. It was the sound that told pilots the fight was already lost. Because once you lose the sky, you lose the war beneath it. And that is why, decades later, Japanese forces remembered the P-51 Mustang, not just as an aircraft, but as the moment the air itself turned against them.